Thank you.
Go ahead.
So I called this session an iterated world because we still may be blessed with Christian Pongratz's presence today. And what tweaked my interest with Christian's work is that he's doing really high level 3D printing. So when I first met him and heard him talk, he was talking about printing whole buildings as they have been doing in China. Really another world of replicable reality. And I thought it would have been interesting to talk about the implications. But also, while I was waiting for us to start, I was listening to a segment on NPR about a new book by Charles King, Gods of the Upper Air, about people like Boaz, who had thought that races should not mix, and they were distinct and they had distinct capabilities, and so on and so forth. And just when we were coming on, Jean and I were talking about agriculture and the perils of monoculture. So these all tie together in my mind about how, as we become more and more globalized, we also become more and more homogenized, and we just keep replicating what we already have, as Jean was saying about river diversions and plans that are based on high concept instead of high reality. So I would love to start off just informally talking about that, what it means to have a world that is modeled on a few very simple models as opposed to much more complex and diverse models. I wonder if either one of you have comments to make about that.
Well, I'll a couple of thoughts. One is the value of complexity is I think not appreciated. And there's many examples of that. Agriculture is probably one of the bigger ones, where we tend to plant the same crops over and over again, and we're down to just a few types of corn and a few types of soybeans, etc. And there's when you're at that point, you're very vulnerable. Something can come along and find your corn really tasty, and then you're in big trouble. So I think that there's we tend to over-engineer, and engineers tend to try to simplify. And I think that nature teaches us to embrace complexity and embrace diversity, because there's strength in that. And I think we're beginning to learn that, but I think we're a long way away from really understanding and embracing that concept. Another thing you said that triggered a thought, yes, the world is getting smaller. I mean, the ability to communicate around the world via the internet and satellites, etc., has really shrunk the world. But I don't know that, I think it has the capability of not only transmitting bad ideas, but it has the capability of transmitting good ideas. And I do believe it transmits bad ideas. But I think that there's also the hope that it can be a conduit for good ideas as well. I don't think that information itself is necessarily good or bad. You may disagree with that, but I don't know.
Well, I noticed that as you were winding down that thought, and I hope we'll come back to it, Jim, Christian has joined us.
Yeah.
Welcome, Christian. Thank you so much for joining us. Christian is, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're at the New York Institute for Technology, is that correct?
Hello, Aviva, can you hear me?
Yes. Did you hear me try to introduce you?
I just got in right now. Sorry for the delay.
That's all right. We're happy to have you.
Thank you.
maybe I should let you introduce yourself and your work briefly.
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
I'm in New York at the New York Institute of Technology, and have run the School for Interdisciplinary Studies and Education for the last 2.5 years, which has been a prototype at our university where we attempted to bring people and students, the faculty and students together from different disciplines and work together on projects. And also through that, hopefully, initiate new initiatives and partnerships. And right now I'm working on, over the next year, a new interdisciplinary program that will entail a bachelor and a master's degree, but also hopefully some micro-credentials and badges where we would try to bring students into common projects and get credentials for that. And so I'm right now speaking to a lot of industries here in the New York area, and trying to understand workforce development in the future, and skill needs, and the evolution maybe in general of emerging technologies as it maybe relates to AI and robotics and deep learning, machine learning, etc. And above all that, maybe is also maybe the question: how can we, on a more broader basis, bring creative thought, critical thinking, creative thinking, and maybe design thinking across the institution, and with that, maybe hopefully create a larger effort for empathy and maybe hopefully outreach to the communities in New York, which we started, but it needs really, I think, a bit more effort in the near future.
Well, just before you came, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, my background is I'm a practicing architect and designer and writer about theory of design and architecture, and I have in the past worked as an architect in Europe, but also in New York, and I taught at UT Austin and at Texas Tech, and very interested in technology, and have led a Master of Science and program and lab on digital fabrication, including robotics and materials, kind of my expertise.
Okay, well, what I was going to suggest was I wanted to pick up on something that Jim had been talking about just before you got on the line, which is value of complexity. And one of the things that I had introduced the session with before you got on was the question of, to what extent, as we become more globalized, we're also seeing various iterations of monoculture. We're losing complexity as we lose diversity. So I guess one of the things that I would love you to address, Christian, is the question of, to what extent are we in danger of losing complexity as we move deeper into IT and robotics?
That's a difficult one. I want to maybe first say hello. I don't know who else is on the line, but I want to say hello to everyone. And it's of course a enormous pleasure to speak to everyone and use this forum maybe to chat about interesting ideas and projects.
Absolutely. Let me just, I'm sorry that I didn't introduce you more completely, but we have Jean Turner, who's in Baton Rouge at the University, Louisiana State University, I'm sorry, who's an expert on wetlands biology and has been involved with the BP spill monitoring. And we have Jim White, who is, and I hope I get this correct, Jim, the Dean of Arts and Sciences at the University of Colorado in Boulder, who was one of the first researchers to connect the role of plants in carbon sequestration. Have I got you guys pinned a little bit?
Pinned enough.
That's good. Okay, these conversations pretty much, Jim and I, since 2007, and Jean joined us in 2012, and we meet about once a month, and we try to have interesting guests so that we can talk about wicked problems.
Okay. So you wanted me to chime in on the question of erasing complexity?
Yes. What happens to a globalized world with the loss of complexity and diversity? What is the danger of IT and virtual iterations in the kind of natural biological backup systems that are generally versions of iteration?
Mm. Yeah, no, I think, I don't know how to answer this. I think on one hand, I believe that we don't really lose complexity. I think we are in an increase of complexity on one side, and it's probably, of course, driven through the enormous technological progression that we have across the fields. Digital computation is past us, digital communication is past us, and now we are into digital fabrication, and we are basically on the level of creating artificial organs and artificial cellular structures, you know, that can self-replicate, self-organize, etc. And we go deeper on of course, on an atomic level. We understand more about impact on humans, and I guess also on our complete natural environment. So our understanding is increasing as we dig deeper on so many levels, and it gets more complex. I think, in my opinion, for decision makers to really bring all of that together and then make, one would almost think, the right decision, right? Because those fields diverge, they get deeper on either side, and we are missing out on the generalists to bring it back together in some form. And I'm saying that maybe because I'm interested to maybe educate students, hopefully to fill that role in an optimistic way. And on the other hand, you're right, diversity in a certain complexity is eradicated, from my understanding, in a natural environment, as where are we right now? Like 50% of the insect populations in Europe are completely eradicated, just as one example. And the question of sustainability, at least from my point of view, architecture and building construction, has not been dealt with, because houses that we build today, we build them the same like 500 and 5,000 years ago, right? Vitruvius still thought, invented concrete at a time, and still we're building with an enormous amount of concrete, with one of the biggest gas house producing agents, as we know, right? So I think it's somehow a failure from that point of view to really understand the sustainable impact of every action that we do.
I want to pick up this point about concrete, because you and I talked about it a little bit when we first met. It interests me a lot because there's such a tremendous consumption of sand, which has huge implications for any efforts for wetlands restoration. I wonder if you have any further thoughts on that, or Jean, since wetlands is your bailiwick, if you'd like to comment on that question.
I am pretty much uninformed about that, except that there's plenty of, the problems are human problems, not the source of the sand. And Jim will know this better than me, but I understood a while ago that the CO2 production by concrete is less than 5% of the problem, and that it's really the other sources that need to come under control. But I may be wrong on that.
No, you're right about that. I mean, we do, concrete does produce CO2 as it ages. Ironically, it's the reason why Biosphere 2 ultimately failed.
I didn't realize that. Why? What happened exactly?
Well, it's the whole basement was built out of concrete. You know, the top is glass, and it was releasing carbon dioxide. So CO2 levels inside the biosphere were going up to very dangerous levels. And they wanted it to be a completely contained environment, because this was supposed to be something you could build on Mars or something like that.
Right.
And it took them a while to figure out why that was the case, but it was just, you know, one of these, you know, oversights on, okay, I didn't I didn't realize that, you know, when I pour concrete and it's going to age, it's going to produce lots of CO2.
Just going back to the wetlands issue, Jean, my understanding is that the sand is being taken out of coastal areas. In many cases, often, of course, illegally. But wouldn't this have a dramatic effect on beachland erosion?
There's not that much being removed relative to the source. And of course, we have the largest river in the North American continent going down this, and there are lags in how long it takes for the sand upstream to get downstream. I mean, they're more than 1 or 2 decades. And the problems aren't really the shortage of sand, except for people using it to rebuild beaches, which is probably not a good idea in the long run anyhow.
Right. So Christian, what alternatives might there be to concrete? Is this something that your groups are talking about?
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's the material generally has a big issue because there's not enough base research being done around it. And I heard recently that even in Europe, all the different country regulations that we have and all the various specifications of concrete types, there's not even a complete understanding about the perfect chemical mixtures or the different chemical mixtures and the impact. So I mean, even we don't even understand what we use. That's kind of, I think, what I want to say. And
you still there, Christian?
yeah, I'm still there. And yet there is maybe, you know, experiments, of course, to use industrial trash, let's say fly ash or, you know, like waste products of the industry that gets mixed into concrete to reduce maybe the resources that are being used to produce it. So I think there's maybe experimentations on that side. And that might, you know, that gives some kind of help. But I mean, you still have the Portland cement in there. And this is maybe one of the bigger issues of how to replace Portland cement.
So you use the phrase digital fabrication. What are the challenges? Could you please define that a little bit for everybody? And what do you think your opportunities are?
I mean, there's I think the U.S. has been very strong in that part of the last maybe 5 to 10 years or so in pushing the question of what digital fabrication is. So let's say, as an example, maybe about 10 years ago, if you wanted to have a digital fabrication lab that does everything from cutting materials, adding materials, all kind of mixing materials, so CNC machines, laser cutters, 3D printers, you know, you had to spend maybe around, for sure, over $100,000, maybe $250,000. With the miniaturization of desktop fabrication, we are now at the level that you can have all of those various types of material processes, you know, for maybe tens of thousands of dollars in a smaller office lab. So the advances of technology allowed us to experiment maybe now on today's time across disciplines with what materials are, how to work with them, and to produce something new with them. And that could even include reuse maybe of materials. And I think that's really maybe the exciting part about that. And also, and I speak maybe now as an architect and designer, we have been removed maybe since the mid-90s, also maybe because of the economic downturn, etc., from maybe being involved in the actual production, let's say, of architecture. So and this was all because of legal contract, etc., and it has been very much divided, and we didn't have really any input, left alone having a material scientist in the office of an architect, right? But the advances of digital fabrication on that side allowed designers and architects to really start to understand what machines are, what they can do, which materials they can process, and what the actual potential is almost on many scales. and the impact on architectural production in general. And that has had influence on schools in the US. Many of them over the last 10 years established what we call digital fabrication labs. Industrial designers, I think, have been more ahead in time in working with that, but it's of course a smaller scale. And I think that creates a certain body of knowledge, which in an optimistic sense, I would say will certainly shape the future of cities. And if we believe what Gershenfeld at MIT says, and they're of course digging on a more nano level, he laid out this 20-year roadmap where the current revolution of digital fabrication is supposed to go down to the atomic level, where programs would run actually on a cellular or atomic level, and then completely rethink what materials are and how they become produced. And that 20-year roadmap, we are somewhere early on in that. And yeah, maybe another aspect that I wanted to throw in is MIT has been very successful in promoting the idea of a fabrication lab, and they built a network on a global scale with labs distributed or supported, incentivized from MIT on a global scale, and in Africa, in Asia, different places, where they start to educate people about the technology and the potential of, I would call it almost empowering, a democratic empowering of the individual that can, through fabrication, change basically their life or their kind of current situation. They can go to food, it can go to production of habitation, etc. Right. So I think 20-year roadmap and potential to really empower people even in poorer countries.
Well, you've said a bunch of interesting and provocative things. I just want to pick up on one really simple idea that I'm curious about. First of all, it sounds as though the kind of industrial design you're involved with right now has a lot to do with chemistry. Is that correct?
Yeah, biology and chemistry, I think, are key in the further evolvement.
So that's definitely not something that in the past we've associated with, or I've ever associated with architecture. But part of what's provocative about that you implied is that it might be this might be an avenue towards recycling trash. Is that correct?
That's correct. And we do see examples in additive fabrication. That means any way of 3D printing or adding material in some form. We have examples in the recycling plastics industry that gets cut down in pellets, and then you can basically heat it up and reuse it. We have how's it called? Microfoams or mycelium being reused in some form, and yeah, there's many examples in additive fabrication.
And
salt, coffee, yeah.
So your idea is that the reason that this would lead to greater global democratization is that there would be more access to the dwindling resources that we have. Is that correct?
More access to dwindling resources. No, only in the sense that we are in a new type of industrial revolution where the individual is basically, in theory, the factory. Right, so you don't have to go anymore in a factory and go work in a factory where you have a machine that's very big. You have to learn how to work it. But in theory, in a small lab in a community, you could produce or fabricate what you couldn't do before.
Well, it's a pretty provocative idea to think about the individual as a factory. Can you elaborate a little bit on that before we go? I'm sure Jean and Jim have questions for you, but could you clarify that a little bit further? How exactly does the individual become a factory?
Oh, I mean, there's a couple of things, of course, needed. There's a certain formation needed that comes through experience by being exposed to various sorts of equipment. And for example, there is, and maybe it's again the MIT example, they have a lab, let's say, in a place in Lagos in Africa, and they teach young girls how to solder electronic circuits. But then in the same lab, you have also a laser cutter. You can cut materials. You can build electronic circuits. You can additively 3D print with materials. So you can create almost anything. You can say from a bicycle, right, to an automated seedling machine, to, I mean, you know, to housing elements, right? And before they had to do that with somebody like a contractor, or you needed to have to buy industrial products, etc. And now I think the understanding of that you can process materials and at the same time creatively questioning what they can do, I think would allow for the next step in saying, oh, so if this can basically print on top of each other, what else could I feed into that machine that is somehow trash in my neighborhood that I could reuse, right? So I think it's a little bit about education of the organic or non-organic components of materials, but also that machine would allow you, even desktop machines to some sort, allow you to actually produce something out of that.
Yeah, but does that mean that the individual could function in that way independent of a hierarchy that was using their labor?
That's correct, exactly. So now the first step, however, would be how would we empower them? We would have to furnish, on the one hand, the knowledge to them, which is very easy. You can do that online, so they can be distributed globally. The other thing is, of course, you would have to give them at least the knowledge how to build a first machine, right? So let's say we could take a robot. We are working right now with a company from Las Vegas that they build a small robotic arm, and all the knowledge how to cut those parts is basically online open source. So in theory, you could go online if you have plastic sheets and you have a laser cutter. You could go online anywhere in the world, download the printed parts in 3D and cut those parts and build yourself a robot.
So I just want to ask one last question before I open it to Jim and Jean, because I'm curious about this trajectory. If computers in effect changed the workspace so that people don't have to be located in a geographic company, could this be a death knell for the corporate culture in general that we've all been familiar with for so long, where you have a small group of people controlling a very large group of people for all production?
Yeah, that's the big question right now, right? Can digital fabrication, which revolutionizes the production chain of everything, can it actually put into question the traditional relationship of industries and the neighborhoods? Yeah. And I think now the next thing that comes in, of course, is what would you like to produce at home for yourself? And I think these are mostly probably those parts that give you particular pleasure or help you in some form in your life, versus other products that you don't really care about. They might still be produced by certain industries, right? So there might be a differentiation between what does one really want to do if you have all those possibilities.
So Jean, Jim, do either one of you want to jump in and ask Christian some questions about this?
So one question is sort of percolating in the back of my head, Christian. What's the raw materials that are used to basically to produce anything? Is it plastics, or what's the, You know, if I'm
No,
an
I think
and all this technology, what do I need to buy to?
I mean, I think the most promise of all of those is certainly additive manufacturing, right, or additive fabrication. It means that could be the material that is heated, or it has kind of some binder material with it. And there's experiments, for example, where you can use salt, and then you have a kind of a watery binder solution, and you can then spit out from some kind of nozzle a binder material onto a salt bed, right? And you have to move the bed either up or down, and then you move around with your, let's say, with your solution, and you bind the areas that you want to bind. There's, for example, an engineer in Italy. He came up with, we have a waste material in the marble industry. There's kind of a sludge, a humid sludge, like a wet sludge material. And he came up with a binder where it uses a lot of that material from the industry and prints out fairly large structures, right? Again, additive manufacturing. Yeah, I mean, there's examples with coffee. You know, you can bind coffee in some form. So there's many examples out there that use organic or inorganic material in some form. And I think that's just the beginning, because we imagine that a lot of people that have, on the one hand, the knowledge of those machines don't necessarily have knowledge of either or chemical or biological backgrounds of materials, right? So experiments are happening a lot in more on the design side. That's what I see a lot. And it's really often missing maybe then the next step and bring really expertise in and say, okay, oh, now we can do this. Now we can do really that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think we already have seen some of the impact of this. You know, the number of small companies is increasing, and a lot of that's driven by the fact that they can produce their own products. They don't need to, you know, be part of a large corporation to produce something for sale.
Right, and at the same time, we have our society moving towards an extreme personalization.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm wondering whether or not this is, will we see, for example, a return to the rural parts of the developed countries, where the land is cheaper and these people can move, since they don't have to be tied to large manufacturing centers like, you know, Detroit for cars. They can produce what they want to produce where the labor is cheaper and where the land is cheaper.
Well, the big question is, can you produce food this way?
You print food? Well, again, you know, you got to have a raw material to start with.
Right. Well, that's the big question, or that would be the question I would have. What kinds of raw materials would you need to produce food at a time when people are talking about running out of soil and running out of this and that?
Yeah, I mean, you could, I mean, I don't have an answer for all of this, but I'm just saying, you know, I could, instead of me baking my cake with flour, water, sugar, and salt, and some yeast by hand, I could spice all of that into a 3D printer, and you can do that relentlessly 24 hours, 7 days a week. So if I want to make a business out of that, I could make a mini bread factory tomorrow.
Yeah.
So you still need the wheat.
Right. You still need raw materials.
Right, exactly.
Gene, do you have some comments or questions for Christian?
I'm trying to wrap my head around the kind of top-down influences on access to materials and how stratified society is and who's going to have access to those materials. And then the other part is, I know coming up with inventions, it seems like you're a sole person involved or just a small group, but in fact, things don't happen in isolation. They happen or in a sustained way because people have to make a living, so to speak, by groups being able to see each other and talk to each other face to face and to have some continuity
Bless you.
to do that. So
Yeah. I like that thought. I think it could be very much oriented towards a community lab, right? So you have a small village, people meet together, and they come with different backgrounds and knowledge, and they actually start to use that technology for their own purposes.
So I mean, I'm not saying it can't happen. I just don't know how it happens that they have enough discretionary resources to learn and experiment constantly, and that there isn't some other motive of the supplier that sees whatever the control points are, somebody will be there to influence that. So there's kind of like the concept, and then there's the actual doing or observing of how to make it work in a useful way. Because I mean, all these diversity things that come up are within the framework of how humans have a very flat line of cognition. They don't they have this logarithmic increase in information, but we have still only humans are in there. And so I don't know how to frame a question or observation, but
Well, what I hear you saying, Gene, is that the supply side issue of resources is really critical. Who's going to control that? And the corollary question to me is, where are we going to get them all? If we still have an exploding population and we clearly have a major loss of resources, or whatever you want to call it, soil, trees, whatever, how are we going to supply materials for this utopian future without simply recapitulating the hierarchies that we already have?
So it doesn't have to be, I'm willing to take some small incremental betterment rather than the complete. I mean, I want the whole thing to happen, but I'd like to see some incremental increases in the welfare. And you know, for a while we have some discretionary resources to make these things happening. I'm not sure how long we'll be allowed to do that, but that was at any rate, I can see the point of having individual efforts, learning efforts, learning pools, to have, you know, bell cows. Well, we say in the farming. I'm not in the farmer, but to have, you know, leadership people that show you that it can be done, and to give examples that other people follow, and that's helpful. But a lot of this is done with a discretionary energy, so I think it has to happen pretty quickly, because we have more and more people which are going to claim some resources access.
I think what would for me be an how to say an outcome of this whole is that if we rethink the model of the Industrial Revolution, right, which was take resources, make something, and then waste it. And instead, the more we could distribute the understanding of how one produces, and maybe it's a bit in the kind of idea of the circular economy as proposed by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, or the cradle concept that you think about on day one, right? That, okay, which real resources do I need? Can I have them local so that I minimize transportation costs? What can I make with that? Or is something existing that I can reuse, redesign, remake, reuse, and so on?
Yeah.
Right? I think if we could get to that point and could maybe the understanding of how machines work, materials, then just get more and more people involved in the process, so we actually reach those creative minds that maybe don't have access normally to that technology.
All right, I'm going to play devil's advocate. I've got Inner Mongolia on my mind a lot for the past couple of years, because they're experiencing severe desertification, and a complicating factor for them is how China is taking rare minerals out of the earth there and creating toxic problems for their water supply. If you live in Inner Mongolia, where do you get the resources to maximize the potential for this new technology? Or Or does it mean that we just have another few million people immigrating to Europe where they're going to encounter fascism?
I didn't see that coming.
You should have, Jim. We did enough work on the Sudan and Bangladesh.
So that's fair in a way. We have a kind of a dialogue between Plato and Aristotle going on here.
But that's a real issue. Not everybody has access
You're right.
to materials. So can we manufacture materials? Is that an option, Christian?
Yeah, but I think we need some more time to get there. So there was a call from the national defense, what's it called, the military reason, was it 2 years ago, a year and a half ago? So it means somebody in this country knows about it, asking for cellular growth of materials non-locally on any place within a short period of time, such that you could create a supportive structure. And of course, what it alludes to is you could send military in any part of the world, and within maybe hours, they could produce a housing or something, right? Or something in that direction, or some protective shield, or without sending materials across. And I know that on the and I'm not a specialist, but I think on the cellular side, organic growing organs, we are at the level that we understand cellular growth. We have a bit difficulty of once we 3D print them, that they don't collapse. If you have collagen in there or something, that they don't collapse. So there is some research going on right now on the biocellular level of controlling growth of cells and making rigid structures. And I see that maybe as a passageway down and say, oh, at one point we probably can grow materials. So is that provocative enough?
I know they're talking about growing meat, which has been really interesting. Yeah. Is that the same process that you're thinking of?
Probably, yeah, probably.
Well, we only have a few minutes left. Jim or Jean, do you have more questions for Christian? Or Christian, do you have questions for us?
Yeah, I was not aware about that. I'm playing a leading role here today with all of you. I certainly had a pleasure to share some of my ideas, or maybe the things that concern me at large. And I'm still, I'm struggling here on the New York side of coming up with educational formats, so to say, which would allow us to attract students of not just maybe 18 to 23-year-olds, but maybe even adult population in engaging some of those topics, but also in preparing them from a technological side for the future of many of the professions we create. And I'm just, on the other hand, very much concerned about how education, at which point we are right now.
Yes.
And that it's really under disruption, that we ask for a lot of money, but we don't give the value back. And at the same time, we have those large global problems that in the end also go back to education, right? Because everything we spoke about today is something that you could probably speak about with people in remote areas and just make them aware about that and see how locally one could respond maybe to that new paradigm. And so it's all about education. I mean, if you're honest, the future of jobs, the future of work, the new jobs that we create, all the technological disruption, AI and machine learning, etc., everything is about formation and education. And we don't have the tools yet, I think, left alone those century-old degree programs that don't respond to it. So that's kind of what I'm really struggling with.
Do you have a way of kind of allowing them to come up with their own identified problem and say, here, do it? or kind of not, things are so impersonal these days, and that people, I think, are still people, so that if they're let go, so to speak, with no net to fall into, that they will make their own net. And kind of course, you have to guide them as a teacher, but I mean, make sure things are done responsibly, but you don't really know what they're going to come up with. And it's, if they get enough strength to trust each other and to try things, they may actually come up with something. It's kind of fun, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just if they could, I know growing a garden, you don't know what's going to do until you try it. And I remember that spread in New York Times Magazine that it was a 2-page spread on growing tomatoes. It was something that everybody down south does all the time, but people in the city in New York had no experience with. And so
that's correct. Yeah.
They were really enthused about it. They were saying how much they enjoyed it, and they learned so much, And it seems like you could do the same thing with anything in our system at the
Jim,
moment.
what's your experience with self-study programs in Boulder?
Say that again?
What's your experience with self-study programs?
We have, actually, this could easily be a full hour's conversation. I'm chairing a committee on interdisciplinary education right now, or what I call the education of the future. Basically, how do we design an educational system that will allow people to pursue all the various avenues of education that they want to pursue? What we're seeing today, for example, are students who are combining traditional disciplines in very different ways. For example, we have students who are interested in food, but they're interested in manufacturing. So they're, those are the kids who are going to be interested in printing burgers and, stuff like that. And we don't, we want to provide for them the educational opportunity to do that. And one of the struggles we have, I think, Kristen, you were alluding to this, is we have the old disciplinary structures aren't really conducive to dealing with a lot of the changes that have occurred, the disruptions that have occurred in manufacturing, in other areas of human endeavor. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is figure out ways in which we can remove some of the impediments that exist to faculty and to students, so that they can, find interesting ways to pursue minors, majors, certificates, micro-credentials, etc.
Yeah, that's what I am also working on. We should have maybe a separate conversation about that. I like that.
Well, perhaps.
Yeah, because as a dean, one of my tasks is to identify what are the structural impediments. What is it that keeps Gene Turner from being the best Gene Turner that he can possibly be?
Genetics.
Oh, come on. Let's not blame genetics.
Yeah, but
anyway,
we have them.
Universities are notorious for setting up reward structures that are really unintended, and then we turn around and go, "Why did you do that?" And faculty will go, "Well, because you incentivized me to do that." Anyway, it's a separate conversation, but I think it's an interesting.
Well, I hope, Christian, you'll come back and maybe we can pursue that particular conversation. Thank you.
Definitely. Yes.
Wonderful.
It was a pleasure.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was great.
See you guys.
We're shutting down unless somebody has some last thoughts. I know, Jim, you're going to vanish at 3:30 on the dot, and it's 3:31. Bye, Jim. Christian, I know that you took time from your conference, so that was very kind of you. And I thought it was really interesting. You brought up a lot of really provocative ideas. Thank you again.
Yeah, would you please be so kind and also share maybe in a separate email the various participants so we can continue maybe even between us some ideas back and forth until the next meeting?
Sure.
Yes. Yes. And we'll keep you on our mailing list.
Excellent.
The next webcast is going to be a combination of talking about contiguity in forest systems, how important that is, and the nuclear industry.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, so we'll keep you informed.
You guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Shut down. And Christian, this is recorded, so it will go